Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's an honor to rise tonight to speak to Bill S-218, the creation of a Latin American Cultural Month in the month of October. Obviously, this is a heated debate over a very controversial bill, which is why we have 6 hours devoted to it. I have been a member of Parliament for 7 years. This is the first time I've been allowed to rise in debate during private members' bill hour when it wasn't my own bill. So I spoke to my own bill, Bill SC442 in the previous Parliament, which created a Lyme disease strategy. So for those who are political nerds and might wonder why it would be that a member in my position doesn't usually speak on private members' bill, well, private members' business is usually brief, and speaking slots are hard to find. And for some reason this evening, I was able to get a much coveted speaking slot on Latin American Heritage Month for Canada. Now, for viewers somewhere in, or historians opening up Hansard at some point covered in dust, some decades from now, I think we should reveal that this is the success of 6 hours of debate on a non-controversial private member's bill is a tribute to political and procedural shenanigans in this place. And somehow or other, and the credit or blame, one might say how clever, is to Conservatives who managed to force an extra 5 hours of debate on this bill. Now, that's not to minimize that this is a great bill, but I do want to explain why we're here when there are other, and I have to admit this, and I don't want to do any, not out of any disrespect to anyone watching or anyone, and as I do, who cares about Latin American heritage. No disrespect intended, but there are more pressing matters facing the nation. However, tonight for 6 hours, we are debating Latin American Heritage Month. Now, I want to turn my attention to that and start, as others have, by paying tribute to a departed colleague from the other place, Senator Vega, whom I knew. His death was a terrible shock to all of us. He was on parliamentary business when he died quite suddenly, and it was a terrible thing, as is always the case when someone dies unexpectedly in doing their work on behalf of this place. This private member's bill comes to us from someone who didn't have Latin American heritage, and I think that's quite interesting. I'm happy to support it. And I want to say that my riding of Saanich Gulf Islands, while we have a very vibrant community that's Latin American, it is indeed small. The language of Spanish is spoken, Portuguese is spoken by but not by very many. I do want to share with you, though, that Spanish names and Spanish heritage are commonly found in the geography of place. So in the colonial waves that came across Turtle Island, the Spaniards, of course, came. And if you look at my riding, my representation is Saanich Gulf Islands. Well, Saanich, of course, is a Sinchothan word, indigenous, Wasanich. It actually means the people who are rising. But the islands, the Gulf Islands, you'll find there's Galiano Island. Galiano Island is named after a Spanish explorer from 1792. There's Saturna Island. Now, Saturna Island is actually named for a naval schooner, not a person, the Santa Santarina, that came to the Gulf Islands in 1791. I could digress and discuss the pig war that took place between at Saturna Island. It was a hotly contested piece of real estate. It's amazing that it isn't now, by the way, because if anyone's never really looked at a map of southern Vancouver Island, you should, because you'll find that where I live is actually south of the 49th parallel, and I look due east at the state of Washington. So it's a territory that is entirely shared lands and waters. And some of those shared waters are the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Now, Juan de Fuca goes way back. Juan de Fuca was actually a Greek, but he was exploring on behalf of King Philip II of Spain in 1580s, and the Strait of Juan de Fuca is one that is terribly threatened by Aframax tankers loaded with dilbit. but that's a different debate. The entertainment value from across the ways may distract me from telling you about Portuguese Joe. Because, this is fascinating. Stay with me. Portuguese Joe was the first European to live in Stanley Park. He was actually born in the Azores in 1828. He lived in Stanley Park, outside of course, where Vancouver is now, and he married the granddaughter of none other than the great Chief Capilano. He really brought Portuguese culture and heritage to Vancouver proper, the Lower Mainland, and in his later years, he moved to Reed Island. He actually bought a chunk of Reed Island, which is off Galiano, and that's, if people keep giggling, I'm going to have a hard time. He passed away on Reed Island, having had 2 First Nations wives. The first, as I mentioned, the granddaughter of Chief Capilano, the second from the Seychelles Nations. All of this connects Indigenous culture and Latin American culture, which is what I wanted to reflect on. Because so far tonight, we've talked of Latin American culture exclusively in its colonial connotations. We've talked about Spanish dancing, we've talked about Latin language, we've talked about yummy food. Let me just cast our minds to the reality that Latin America is an indigenous place. We stand tonight on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation. Much of Latin America is traditional territory of Mayan, of Quechua-speaking peoples, and this is being reflected right now for anyone who wants to go to UBC's Museum of Anthropology, starting on May 17th and running till October 8th, is an exhibit on the art of resistance, politics and the past in Latin America. And those who put this exhibit together, and it's traveled, there's a write-up in the New York Times if you want to read about it, look at the political overlay of how politics and oppression show themselves forward in the arts of indigenous people of Latin America. Now, it might seem incongruous that of all places in Canada, that the arts of resistance, politics, and the past in Latin America is on exhibit where? In our Museum of Anthropology at UBC campus. I don't know how many of you have been to the Museum of Anthropology at UBC campus, but it's a spectacular place which is overwhelmingly British Columbia culture, indigenous arts. There's a lot of original Bill Reed pieces. There are carved totems, Nuu-Chulnith and Haida and Saanich. There's a whole range of indigenous arts of British Columbia. And that's the place that people can go right now to get a sense of what kind of art expresses itself from people who are marginalized and oppressed by colonialism within Latin America. So the connections between Canada and Latin America are not only those of our colonial history, which we share, those who have moved to Canada who come from a colonial past, but many people who've come to Canada from Latin America also come from that indigenous tradition, whether from Honduras or Guatemala or Mexico or from wherever they've come from Latin American countries. They also often come with a connection to their indigenous traditional past and that culture which infuses so much of the richness of history throughout Latin America. One of my constituents, by the way, Ronald Wright, is a best-selling author who has well documented these connections in his book Stolen Continents, or in his review of so much of indigenous culture, Time Among the Maya, or really a lot of reflection on indigenous culture in A Short History of Progress, although that mostly focuses on the foibles of hubris, Western civilization, and greed. However, Latin American Cultural Month, I believe this controversial bill will pass. And I believe that we will celebrate every October with great gusto across party lines, that if nothing else, it brought parliamentarians together on a June night in 2018 for a 6-hour debate, which is not the first hour of debate, but the second hour of debate, which is a 6-hour of debate, that allows us to say Latin American culture is alive and well in Canada. We celebrate it. Merci, miigwech, gracias, muito obrigada. Thank you very much.